Hey, welcome to Wednesday night. Should say welcome back to Wednesday night. We took last week off, was hanging out with a couple of pastors. We had a fantastic time. So hope you all missed us. We are going to be on a summer schedule. And the question should be asked, hey, how do we know what week we're on in the summer schedule? So I'm super glad that you asked, because this is our website. This is brookridgecommunity.church. And there are a few things we can do on the website. You can contact us. We do all our giving through the website. For media, thought this would interest potentially. So we have all our sermon series on here, and you can keep loading and keep loading. So we have probably 5 years worth of messages on here. So we keep the series together. Jared does a fantastic job maintaining our website. Hey, Layla. And what you can do, so this was last week's message, Law and Grace. And when you view it, you have the choice to either watch it, and that would be the full YouTube video, or you can just listen to the message if you want to, that's in podcast form. So either way, if you want to catch up, we like to do things in series at Brookridge. And so if you want to catch up on the series, you can do that through the media link. But then we also have this link for our calendar. So this is our Brookridge calendar that we're trying to keep updated. This is kind of a soft opening for our calendar. We've been trying some things with it, and then in September, we're going to throw everything on there. But for now, you'll be able to see things like Wednesday Night Live. Hey, June 19th, right now, it's happening. Awesome. Next one will be, I just tried to click on the wrong screen. The next one is July 3rd. So you'll know that's 2 weeks from tonight. So you will notice that next week, June 26th, there's nothing on the calendar, which means there's no Wednesday Night Live. So you can see things like the Crognali family, our missionary doctors from Kenya, are going to be here this Sunday. So we're excited about them. I get the chance to speak at another area church. So AJ and I will be gone this Sunday, but you will be in good hands. Dino Crognali and Janice have been friends of Brookridge for a long time, like 15 years, like predate me. And we've been able to support them and partner up with them for quite some time. So it's always exciting to get to hear from our missionaries. So that's Sunday. So yes, so we have calendar options at Brookridge. So again, this is brookridgecommunity.church. So there you go. That was for free. Let's see what I missed. Helen is here. Hey, Helen. Yeah, I hope everybody was able to stay cool today and tomorrow. Air conditioning is a wonderful thing. AJ is here. Oh, wow. 88 in the office at work. That you would think that GE would be able to keep their central air going. Pastor Brian Spicer, speaking of who I was hanging out with last Wednesday, we are back on and in summer form. All right. So before we jump into Romans, promised you some more interweb posting fails. So let's do it. Again, this is the public service announcement. Before you hit post, you may want to read it or have somebody else read it so that you don't end up on Wednesday Night Live. So here's a very legit question. The Little Seizures clothes at 8. Get this person some pizza is all I'm saying, because they are hangry and they butchered the spellings of all that. All right, here's another one. You're just cooking and maybe getting some help from people on the internet. Yep, add a bit of butter. Voila. So that is actually spelled the way that you say it, but not spelled correctly. Here we go. What are they being fed? I'm guessing we're talking about squirrels. They're saying acorns from the oak tree, unlimited acorns. Nice. Just what every squirrel needs. This is an interesting one. Why don't tattoo places just euthanize their clients? Legitimate question. And then they doubled down. I drive around a lot for work, and I recently saw some signs for a dentist that says they offer euthanasia for their clients who might be scared of going to the dentist. So let's just stop there and say I think anesthesia is the word they're looking for. Euthanasia is something very different. We don't want our dentists and our tattoo places euthanizing their clients. Conversation between a couple of friends. Might be former friends after this, but your man doesn't have the mental strength to caramelize onions. Your man thinks it takes 5 to 10 minutes to caramelize onions. And then someone asks, who's caramelizing onions? Have you sociopaths forgotten that apples exist? Which begs the question, do you think that caramelizing onions is putting caramel on onions? Your man thinks caramelizing onions is putting caramel on onions. That is not what caramelizing onions is. I'm sorry they feel that way. So here I think we're talking about a video game here. And we get down to the advice piece. It says, my advice is to chocolate up to a bug and not abuse it. Just drop it on the ground. And yes, the phrase is chalk it up, not chocolate up, like drawing a plan on a chalkboard. And then the person doubled down. At least they have a sense of humor. At least my answers are delicious. Chocolate up, folks. Here we go. This song's going to be in an animated movie, something like Hotel Transylvania. Mock my words. That's exactly what we're doing right now, sir. We're mocking your words. There's so much wrong with comments on here. It's actually made me realize why chivalry is dead, and I have a genuine dislike for people. Chivalry is what they were looking for. Nobody wants to be shivved. Here we go. This is somebody selling this. Again, we've looked at some crazy things that people have sold online. So this was listed as a World War II. I'm guessing what they were thinking was diorama, but that is just a horrific spelling of diorama. And we move on. It's literally not. Use a calculator. This always goes well. Maths. How is it not right? 51.30 plus 23.70 is not 75. I actually think it is. I've never quite had the attention span for that. Yes, you also haven't had the attention span to pay attention in spelling and grammar. Here's a small one. You might not be able to see this, but it says, it sounds like a Twilight Zone or Monkey's Paw situation. I believe Twilight Zone is what they were looking for. And continuing to move on. I feel like it's just a common courtesy to tip. I don't know. Common courtesy is what we're looking for. Chivalry was dead at the office today. Yes, no one was shivering. Apparently it was very warm in the office. Sorry, Jonathan. Another thing sold on the internet, being bags. Okay, if you would like a being bag, you can get a couple of them for $50. Very sketchy. This got to be a deformation of character. Defamation is what you're looking for. And then a most serious disease, a kind of disease that makes them cannabis to their own kind. My guess is they were thinking cannibals, like some sort of zombie apocalypse, but a kind of disease that makes them cannabis to their own kind. Very serious. And then another thing sold, the most delicious cabinet in the world, a little churro cabinet. Churro. Guessing curio was perhaps what they were looking for, but went with churro. Okay. Awesome. So be careful what you post. This is again, public service announcement. Check before you post, or pray before you post, like we said all throughout 2020 and COVID. Okay. So let's get into Romans. Go. Nice. Romans chapter 7. This is where we are. So here's the deal. So you've reached Romans 7 with us. Congratulations. We are so very close to the halfway point of Romans. But in Romans 6, we finished that up a couple weeks ago. Paul started the discussion of why Christians still struggle so much with sin, a legitimate question. And we talked about the fact that if you ever wonder if Jesus and his resurrection power that lives in us, if it's really inside of us, why do I still struggle so much with these same old temptations. Why don't I love God more? Why is prayer so hard for me? And Paul talks about his own struggle with this in Romans chapter 7. And so it really is one of the most encouraging chapters in the Bible, which we're going to cover over our next 2 sessions. So Paul's self-account here in Romans 7, and it kind of parallels the classic book by Robert Louis Stevenson called Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You know, they say the definition of a classic book is a book that everybody's heard of that nobody's actually read. This one is actually worth reading. Stevenson was a believer and was probably, or almost certainly inspired by the struggle that Paul describes in Romans 7 when he was writing this book. In the story, Dr. Jekyll, a fine, upstanding citizen, is frustrated because it seems like inside of him, there's a bad part and a good part. And the bad part of him is always holding back the good part of him. And so he calls himself an incongruous compound of good and bad mixed together. So Dr. Jekyll, being a chemist, develops this potion that separates the two parts of him so that only the good part comes out by day. That's Dr. Jekyll. And the bad part comes out at night, Mr. Hyde, whose name derives from the word hidden or hideous. The two exist alone, with neither restraining the other. The problem is, as the story goes, the evil part of Dr. Jekyll was far more evil than he had imagined. Mr. Hyde's every thought was centered on himself. He was spiteful, angry, vengeful. He murders people. Dr. Jekyll said, "I was tenfold more wicked than I ever thought." And so Stevenson, speaking through Dr. Jekyll, explains, "I discovered through this process that man is not truly one, but two. It wasn't that I was a hypocrite," he said. He said, "both sides of me were completely sincere." And maybe that resonates with you. It does with me. I feel sometimes like an incongruous compound of completely opposite people. That word means not in harmony or keeping with the surroundings or other aspects of something. It's like two things that just don't mix. They don't make any sense that these are together. There's a part of me that wants to do the right thing. And there's another part of me that doesn't want to do it at all. And both of those parts are really sincere. That's what Paul talks about in Romans 7. And he describes his experience both before Jesus and then after being a Christian. So we're going to dive into this. Tim Keller says this chapter basically divides into 3 sections. And I think it's helpful to read the chapter this way. So verses 7 through 13, which we'll cover tonight, describe the battle that we can't win. Verses 14 through 25 describe a battle we can't lose. And then verses 1 to 6 give us an analogy that show us how to make the transition between the two, the winning and the losing. So I'm going to read verses 1 through 6 first, simply because they come first in the chapter, but I'm not going to really comment on them until our next session, because they're really Paul's answer to his own dilemma. Let me warn you, these first verses are going to sound maybe weird and a little bit random, but the analogy is really brilliant. And we'll see that in a couple of weeks. I just don't want you to worry about it if you're confused in our first pass through. So here we go. Romans chapter 7. Or do you not know, brothers, for I am speaking to those who know the law, that the law is binding on a person only as long as he lives. For a married woman is bound by law to her husband while he lives, but if her husband dies, she's released from the law of marriage. Accordingly, she will be called an adulteress if she lives with another man while her husband is alive. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law. And if she marries another man, she's not an adulteress. Very random. After everything we've read, all of a sudden, Paul just puts this in here. It's like, I have no idea what point Paul is trying to make here. He goes on in verse 4, say, likewise, my brothers, you also have died to the law through the body of Christ, so that you may belong to each other. So here's his point very briefly. Before Jesus, we were married to the law. This is what he was saying. The law, he has already explained in Romans, is whatever standard that you think proves your worth and gains acceptance. You were married to that. It was the center of your life. It was how you established your identity, what told you that things were going to be okay in the future. It's how you established your worth. It could have been religious law, like you were a good enough Christian, so God was going to take care of you. Or it could have been that you were a good enough student, had enough talent, worked hard enough, or a good parent, or a successful businessman, whatever it was. But when you became a Christian, you died to the law, which meant that you died to your keeping of the law as your basis for acceptance. and now you're married to him, bride of Christ, right? So now Paul says in verse 4, so now you belong to him who has been raised from the dead, in order that we may bear fruit for God. For while we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions, aroused by the law, were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. But now we are released from the law, having died to that which held us captive, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code or the law. So that's section 1. We'll come back to it. But let's keep moving on to verse 7. We're going to talk about the battle that we can't win. So Paul says, what should we say then? What then shall we say? That the law is sin? He picks up the objection that he knows his religious Jewish readers would be raising. Remember, a lot of Romans is Paul anticipating the response to what he's going to say and then just answering it to save them the trouble of asking. So he could just hear people saying, Paul, you're really hard on the law. You're saying it arouses sinful passions, that it multiplies sin, that we need to die to it. You really think the law is bad, don't you? And he goes on and says, absolutely not. By no means. On the contrary, I would not have known sin if it were not for the law. And it's really cool on Sundays. So in parallel to Romans, we've been going through Exodus and then Leviticus on Sundays. And so you who have been following with us know this. The law's first purpose was to reveal how sinful we are. We've said it's like a mirror that shows us how far short we fall of God's standard of goodness. Imagine it this way. If you had a full-length mirror that had an outline of you at your ideal build and weight, so that every time you look into it, you'd see the difference between what you should be and what you are. You're like, man, I need to move some of these love handles right over to my biceps. But that's what the law does. Here's what you should be. Now compare that to what your heart actually is. That's the purpose of the law. So Paul continues and says, for example, I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had said, do not covet. Coveting, of course, is wanting something that somebody else has and feeling like you won't be satisfied or happy until you have it. The law said the righteous heart, the healthy heart, is a heart that doesn't covet. So here we go. In verse 8, but sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, this is Paul writing, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. For apart from the law, sin lies dead. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin came alive and I died. The very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me. And then in verse 13, it was sin producing death in me. Did that which is good then bring death to me, he says, in order that sin might be shown to be sin, and through the commandment might become sinful beyond measure. What does he mean by all that? So here's the deal. When Paul says in verse 9, once I was alive apart from the law, he means that before he had really considered the 10th commandment about not coveting, he felt alive. He looked at himself as a pretty good person. He knew the 10 commandments, and he was like, never committed adultery, I don't steal, I've never killed anybody, I care for my parents, I don't worship idols, I observe the Sabbath, I tithe. But then in the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet, it gripped him. So the commandment came into his life. And because that command has nothing to do with external obedience, it focuses on the heart, Paul started to realize that even with all of his external conformity to the other commandments, his heart just chafed against this one. He was envious of others. He wanted what they had. And to make matters worse, as Martin Luther pointed out, this is the commandment behind all the other commandments, which is why it comes last. Why do we steal? Luther asked. You covet what somebody else has. Why do you lie? Quite often it's because you want something and you can't get that with the truth. So you exaggerate your accomplishments, or you minimize your faults to gain approval, or you lie to obtain a position or an advantage that you couldn't get with the truth. Why commit adultery? You covet sex or a relationship with somebody that God hasn't given to you. So Paul saw that he was guilty of the very heart of sin, the root. And here's the real twist. He started to see that even his zeal in religion was fueled by covetousness. What made him zealous in religion was that he wanted respect and status and distinction above other people. So, what do when you realize that one of your primary motivators in religion is itself sinful? You feel like a part of you has died. And that's when the wheels came off, because that just made him more insecure with God, which made him even more zealous to show that he was better than other people. And that made him even more of a 10 commandment breaker. His attempts to keep the commandment, that 10th one, just made him worse. That's what he means by when he said, sin through the commandment produced in me coveting of every kind. He said, when the commandment came, sin sprang to life again and I died. Sin produced death in me so that sin might become sinful beyond measure. We talked a few weeks ago, we used an analogy. And I said, if you were in bed sick with the flu, and I showed up in your room and started to give you commands like, you shall not have a fever, you shall not feel weak, you shall not have the chills or cough or have a headache, all things normal person with the flu would do without a law. But every time I gave you a law, I would just multiply the ways that you couldn't keep it. You'd be like, I get it, I'm sick. And here's the irony. The harder you tried to keep those laws, likely the worse you would get. Like, thou shalt not feel weak. You jump up and try to act strong, you're just going to get worse. Paul is saying that's similar to what happened to me spiritually. He said, the harder I tried to keep the law to prove that I was a good and worthy person, the more my coveting and insecurity and jealousy flared up. He said, my insecurity in religion turned me into an awful person. And then he started to realize he needed a different solution than the law. So when Jesus appeared to Saul before he became Paul on the road to Damascus, you can read the story in Acts chapter 9. He makes a strange passing comment, and it's not in every translation of the Bible. If you read it in the New King James or the King James, so we all know heaven's kind of opened. Jesus speaks to Saul, knocks him off his horse. He blinds him. He sees a bright light. But in Acts chapter 9, you know what? I'll show it to you. And then we'll change the translation. Here we go. So as he journeyed, he came near Damascus. Suddenly a light shone from heaven. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? We all know that part. He said, who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, who you're persecuting. And then this little part here, he said, it's hard for you to kick against the goads. In the King James, it says, it's hard for you to kick against the pricks. And you're like, all right, so what does that mean, and why was that? Why is it not in one translation and in another? So hard for you to kick against the pricks or the goads. It was a Greek proverb, but it was also familiar to the Jews and anyone who had made a living in agriculture. An ox goad was a stick with a pointed piece of iron on its tip used to prod the oxen when plowing. So the farmer would prick the animal to steer it in the right direction. Sometimes what would happen is the animal would rebel by kicking out at the prick or by moving really quickly against it, which would result in the prick being driven even further into its flesh. In essence, the more an ox rebelled, the more it suffered. So Jesus' words to Saul on the road to Damascus were, it is hard for you to kick against the pricks. This is what Jesus was talking about. One of the goads that he was feeling was the conviction of the 10th commandment and his inability to keep it. And so Jesus arrested Saul's life, changed his name to Paul, and encouraged him, hey, listen, you're fighting in all the wrong ways. You're not the person who you're meant to be. You're not the person that I mean you to be. I have a better life for you. And it doesn't mean just keeping a bunch of rules that you can keep to make yourself feel good. It's about following me. It's about a heart change in the way that you deal with me, Jesus was saying, in the way that you deal with other people. In that interaction with Jesus, he said, just stop fighting and give in, because we can't win that battle. Our hearts are not good. And Jesus was saying to Paul, you need to give in. I will give you a new heart that wants to serve me. And we still see that it's not a perfect situation. Paul still said, we're going to talk about it next time, but the famous verse, listen, the things I want to do, I find myself not doing. The things I really need to do, and the things I don't want to do, I find myself doing. Yeah, that sounds like all of us. This is a battle that none of us can win, but there's also a battle that none of us, that we can't lose when we're in Jesus, because he is with us and he gives us the strength to do the right thing, to fight sin. That's why we do this as a community. We are fighting sin together. That's why accountability is so important. That's why hanging out together, not just hanging out, but being involved in each other's lives, and encouragement and teaching, and everything that we do as a church community to grow and change together. Super, super important. So yeah, that's the first part of Romans 7. Paul realized through the law that his sinful heart needed to be changed. He needed a solution that was outside of the law, and he found it in Jesus. When Jesus knocked him off his horse, called him to be the person that he was, and that's exciting. And he does the same thing for us. Like, stop striving, stop trying in your own strength to be enough. You like grace. Remember, we talked about this past week, the law and grace. Grace says you're already enough because Jesus died for you, because Jesus came and lived the life that you couldn't. He died the death that you deserved, and he offers us new life and hope and purpose. And then we obey what God tells us to do, not because it earns us salvation, but because we just want to please him, because it's a relationship with him. Relationships lead to redemption. Relationship with God is important. Relationship with us is important. And then how we live out the Bible together should cause other people to want to know God and spend time with us too. All right. That's it. Another Wednesday. I hope the rest of your week is great. I hope tomorrow you are in some air conditioning and not staying out in the sun too long. It's gonna break temperature wise this week, so it shouldn't be too bad at Brookridge, but we got out the huge fans just in case. Again, I'll miss you on Sunday, but I'm very excited for you all to hear Dino Carnali. He's a great guy and has some really cool stories about what God is doing to use them in Kenya. So excited about that. Excited to see you in a couple weeks. And we will talk to you soon. For those of you that jump over to Bay State, 7:30 to 8. I believe Bay State is on tonight, so you can watch Brian Spicer for the next half hour, and that'll be great. Oh, speaking of great, best man at my wedding, Jeremy Fedorchik. Love you, buddy. All right. Talk to y'all soon.